So I've got a little bit of a different take on the story that we find in Genesis chapter 22. This is a story of when God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. I know. Even just thinking about that, if God were to ask me to sacrifice my child, I still don't know how I would respond to that. But Abraham was willing to do it nevertheless. Now, let's give a little bit of context to this story. We find Abraham in a situation where he and his wife, Sarah, couldn't have children for the longest time. And at some point, God intervenes and he says, listen, I've got a plan, I've got a mission, and I need you all to be involved in it. And because I need this plan and this mission to happen, I'm going to use you all, and I'm going to make sure that Sarah becomes pregnant and she gives birth to a son. And then that will start just this legacy of you all's family, and it will turn into the people of Israel that you and I now have come to know in the Bible. And so they're a little confused at first because they're like, God, we're getting up there in age. How can we now still have children? But God is like, don't worry about it. I'm going to do it. This is my promise to you, and I'm going to be faithful to make sure that my promise actually happens. Trust me. Trust me. We actually see Sarah in previous chapters when God gives them this news. We actually see Sarah sort of chuckle to herself a little bit and mock God a little bit and say, God, almost like, God, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm old. My husband's old. This isn't happening anymore. And God doesn't like that. God doesn't like that she doesn't actually believe him, because God makes sure to tell them over and over, trust me, I've got you, trust me. This is my promise to you. This is my plan. And I am faithful to make sure that it actually does happen. And so eventually, because God is God, life is lifing, but God is also Godding, it actually does happen. Abraham and Sarah end up having a son named Isaac, who is the beginning of this legacy and this promise that God has given to Abraham and Sarah. Let's go to the Bible. I have mine right here with me. And we are reading Genesis 22, verse 1, all the way through verse 19. Yeah, so we've got a good little chunk to read. If you have your Bible with you, go ahead and read with me. Ready? All right, here we go. Verse 1, the sacrifice of Isaac. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. And so Abraham rose early in the morning. First of all, let's just do a little pause there. Let's pause there. In this season of my life, I've found this particular word in verse 3, so, one of the most powerful words in the Bible. The word so. I see this a lot in the story of Joshua and Moses as well, also in the story of the prophets, Elijah, Elisha, because it usually happens, or we usually see it after God has spoken to someone. God says, go do this, go do that. I want this to happen, that to happen. And it says, and so Abraham rose, and so Joshua, and so Moses. I love that it just seems to stand for so much obedience. God said this, and so I did that. God said, go there, and so I did. Like God's voice just beckoned them to be obedient. God said that, and so naturally I did that. God told me to go there, and so naturally, as a natural response to God, I did XYZ. And I just think it's such a powerful word. Anyway, let's resume our regularly scheduled programming. Okay, so verse 3, Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac, of course. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Man, how hard that must be to see this place where you're going to have to do something that's going to hurt you so much. You see the hurt coming. Man, that's for another day. Verse 5, then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. And so they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." In the same way he said, "Here I am" to God. He said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went both of them together. I love how you can see here as well where that Abraham says God will provide for himself. This is another way of another instance in which Abraham testifies of God's character, testifies of the God he's gotten to know to his son. God is one who provides for himself. We don't need to provide for him. That's who God is. And I love that he's sharing that with his son. He's sharing the God he knows with his son. Verse 9. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." Ugh, I'm going to have to do a separate study on that. He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now that I know you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. I love that part, by the way. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked. Just a few verses ago, he also lifted up his eyes and looked, and he saw this sorrow. He saw something that made him feel such pain. And now he's lifting up his eyes and he's looking and he sees a solution. He no longer sees a problem. He sees something that makes him rejoice. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. And so Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said to this day. "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." Verse 15, we're almost done. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son." I love how God keeps emphasizing that. Your son, your only son. It was all you had. And Jesus, of course, as we know, is also God's only son. So there's a parallel there, or there's a connection there. Verse 17, "I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." And so Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba. And Abraham lived at Beersheba. I just love God's word. And what I love about this story is that in Genesis chapter 21, the title for the chapter is the birth of Isaac. So this is the birth of the promise. And then in Genesis chapter 22, the first title, the title of the first paragraph is the sacrifice of Isaac. So it's so funny how chapter 21 is about this birth, about this promise showing up, about God showing himself faithful, right? Sort of God building a rapport with Abraham and Sarah and saying, "You see, I'm going to do what I said I was going to do. You can trust me. You can believe me." And then in chapter 22, what we see here is the sacrifice of Isaac. So God's given this promise. He's shown himself faithful. And now God's asking something of them. And I can't help but wonder if this was God's way of testing Abraham and Sarah. If this was God's way of saying, okay, I've gone through all this trouble to reaffirm, to reassure you that I am going to come through. And as you can see, the thing that you thought was impossible, I have made it possible because I am the provider. I've just done it not that long ago. And so now we're in the next chapter, and I'm asking you to sacrifice this thing. I wonder if God is asking them, do you truly know me? Based on what I've shown you, based on my behavioral pattern, based on my behavioral signature, as I like to call it, how have I introduced myself to you? How have you gotten to know me? Is it as a God who lies or as a God who is faithful to provide? Show me. Through your faith, through your actions, show me how you know me. So this morning I was reading Genesis 22 again, and I find that whenever I hear the story being told in church context, the focus is usually on Abraham and how he was credited for his faith, in the sense that he was so willing to sacrifice his son for to God. He was so willing to take the thing that God had given him and give it back to God because it belonged to God, right? And he was, in essence, showing God that he was willing to put God above everything, even above his blessings, even above his own feelings, even above, his love for his son as a father. And I think that that's definitely something, that is valuable to teach. But I also want to just give you a different perspective. In the chapters before Genesis 22, God has already given Abraham the promise. God has already told him what was going to happen, what he planned to do, and he included Isaac in that promise. He said, I'm going to make you a father of all nations. I'm going to make the people that come from you almost like sand, like you won't even be able to count it. That's how big your people and your legacy is going to become. And I'm going to begin to do that through Isaac. So Abraham already knew that Isaac was that portal. Isaac was the start of the legacy. Isaac was the start of the promise. So he already knew that before God asked him to sacrifice that same promise. So when you look at it from this perspective, the focus is less on Abraham's willingness to give God back what he'd received from God, and maybe a little bit more on Abraham's faith in God's character, faith in God's provision and ability and willingness to save his own promise. Because if God is truly faithful to his word, then that word has to come to pass. And so if God is asking Abraham to kill the very thing that God said he would work through to actually have his promise manifested, then that must mean that God in all his strength, God in all his power, God being omnipotent as he is, would have to resurrect Isaac from the dead because God said what he said. God is truly the definition of I said what I said. And for Abraham to have walked with God for so long, he had built up a behavioral pattern, a behavioral signature, a prototype, if you will, for God. And God is the type of God who does what he said he's going to do. And if God has said something, that he can trust that, because God had also recently shown him that with the birth of Isaac. And so if God has said, I'm going to, through you, through Isaac, have this promise come to pass. If God is asking Abraham to kill Isaac, then surely God must resurrect Isaac, because God does not lie. And so I think from this perspective, the emphasis is more so on Abraham's um, intimacy with God, how well Abraham knew God, so much so that he thought God cannot go against his own word. Regardless of what I do, the promise has to come through this boy. And that's that on that. His faith would have been in God's character, in the fact that God is not a man that he would lie, that his promises are yes and amen, and he does not go against his own word. That's just not who he is. I use this example a lot. I am someone who greatly values kindness. I'm not always nice, but I'm usually kind, right? Because I really value that. And so I think most people who truly know me, if someone were to come up to them outside and go, oh, Consuela was, fighting and she was cussing people out, most people who know me, truly know me, would be like, are you sure? Are you sure it was Consuela? Was it someone who looks a lot like her? Are we talking about the same person? I don't think so, because that's not the person that I know, right? And I feel like in the same way, Abraham approached the situation. He's like, listen, the God I know is XYZ. So if he's asking me to do this, he can't do or be anything else but that XYZ. I don't care what I do. My actions don't matter in this situation, because God's going to have to do what he said he was going to do. That is the God I know, and he does not change. God had shown Abraham a consistent pattern of provision that allowed Abraham to have confidence that even though he was asked to do this very radical thing, he still knew that the radical thing would not be the final thing. I think about a line in a song that I really like. It's called Thanks in Advance. I believe it's by Eris and Chris. Yes, I believe it's by Eris and Chris. The song's called Thanks in Advance. And one of the great lines in that song is, "What's a problem when I know the answer?" I love that it's so simple. What is a problem when I know the answer? And the reason I like it so much is because by definition, by nature, a problem, how I would describe it, a problem is a situation or a circumstance that does not yet have a solution. By nature, if you have a circumstance that was once a problem, if a solution arises, whether you like the solution, whether you're happy with it, whether it makes you happy, whether it's your preference or not, as soon as a solution arises, there is no longer a problem. Something being a problem completely hinges on whether or not there is a solution present or there is an awareness of a solution. Soon as a solution arises, there is no longer a problem. It's almost like darkness and light. When there's darkness, soon as light shines in, that's it. The darkness immediately goes away. Darkness is simply the absence of light, just like cold is simply the absence of warmth. A problem is simply the absence of a solution. You might not like the solution, which might lead to an uncomfortable situation or a conundrum at best, but it's not a problem anymore because there is a solution present. And so, Abraham in this story does not appear to have a problem, not as long as he is acquainted with God, who, in and of himself, is solution. And from that being, he provides, from himself, he provides a natural solution for Abraham in the form of the ram in the bush. So this story shows us God as the provider that we know he is, Jehovah Jireh, but it also shows us God as who is inherently a solution, capital S, if you will. And a being can only produce or reproduce in its own likeness, right? Goats can't birth cows any more than horses can birth hedgehogs. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just not possible. So, God being the solution is able to, from himself, birth or produce only solutions and thus provide a solution for every problem that we have here on earth. The earth is void and dark. Give me 7 days. I got you. Solution. Not good for man to be alone? Go ahead and take a nap. I got you. You let sin in by disobeying me and eating from the fruit? No worries, I've already created the woman to birth the exact thing that's going to end up being the solution. God is in the business of solutions, and often God will call us to secure or become solutions before we're even aware that the problem is coming. See, God might call you to do something now that does not make sense to you or doesn't seem to match the circumstances that you're perceiving right now. But God being omniscient, meaning all knowing, and God being omnipotent, meaning all powerful, all able, he already knows what's coming up ahead. And so he's securing the later in the now. He's developing the solution to tomorrow's problem today. And I believe that we have all been created as solutions because we were made in the image and the likeness of God, who himself is the solution. There are problems in this world that God has made you and I the solution for. I promise you. And all of our life experiences that create this beautiful context that we think count us out are exactly what God uses to count us in when the time comes for us to be activated as a solution to a problem that arises in the world at large or in our world. We are all walking solutions because we are derivatives of a God who is the ultimate solution. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13, I'm reading from the ESV. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape so that you may be able to endure it. So going back to Abraham, Abraham trusted God's being enough to also trust in God's doing. And I pray that God helps us to trust in his pattern of provision like that, to trust God's character enough to know that no matter what he asks of us, he will not go against his own character. And if he asks us to do something that seemingly causes a problem, he is faithful to reach within himself and also provide the solution.